Good Wednesday night to you. I am Thabo Mdluli, and thank you for joining us tonight. As Labour Month unfolds, many in the country remain in limbo, having lost their jobs due to the COVID-19 pandemic. This has exacerbated the country's existing unemployment crisis. Tonight, we explore how much progress has been made on measures to mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on employment and labour. My guest tonight is Employment and Labour Minister Thulas, who is here to respond to allegations of fraud and corruption relating to COVID-19 funds and more. Minister, good evening, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, and good evening, Thabo, and to the viewers of 405.
Minister, let's just reflect, as of course we are just a few days away since the whole world was observing International Workers' Day. Many workers in the country and those who have given up looking for work, all saying there's really nothing to reflect and celebrate on Workers' Day. COSATU particularly saying as long as the third leg of the process of collective bargaining, where it guaranteed a salary increase for public sector workers, is not met, there's really nothing to celebrate. Is collective bargaining under threat?
I don't think so, Thabo. Collective bargaining is not under threat. If there is a dispute, we cannot just say all is not working. We have all the legislation which we are having, and in that legislation, we have a number of dispute resolving mechanisms which can be used in order to break any deadlock which is there. And therefore, we cannot say because there is that impasse in the public sector, therefore all is not working. There are a number of collective bargaining chambers in the different sectors which are dealing with the issues affecting workers, which go beyond the public sector workers. But even the dispute at the level of the public sector, it's a dispute which can be resolved as long as the parties agree to go into negotiations, but also accept that the conditions under which we are now of slow economic growth, the conditions of the pandemic have impacted on the economy as a whole, and have impacted even on the bargaining, on the issues on the table, because at the end of the day, we're talking affordability, we're talking about how much do we have as government, but all I'm arguing is that nothing has collapsed.
But Thulas says, Minister, even as you speak, even when the President was speaking during Workers' Day, you say the right messages, but what happens between what government says and what happens at implementation are two different things. So you don't walk the talk.
We do. All I'm trying to say is that when you go to the negotiations, it's a win-win situation. And you must go there to cooperate, you must go there to look for the solutions. And remember, the agreement which we are referring to, it was reached prior to the pandemic. But now the third leg has to be implemented at this particular time when the economy was down and when there was also a pandemic. And I think all the government has argued for is a need to review some of the elements of that particular agreement. It's unfortunate that things have gone to the extent of going to court instead of us sitting, calling mediation, calling facilitation, and so on, to be able to deal with it. We have had these problems before. Whenever there are deadlocks, we go into call facilitators. Very experienced facilitators would come and deal with all the parties, and we have been able to resolve those problems. And I think other people are talking about a strike. Yes, the workers have the right to strike. The workers can go into a strike. But the reality is that the strike is a tool to be used to unlock the deadlock. At the end, we must come back to the negotiations. And that's what we're appealing to as the Department of Labor, that to those who are representing government and those who are representing the workers, they must go into the table and negotiate these issues, no matter how difficult those issues are.
Let's talk then the impact of COVID-19 and, of course, the deeper issues that come out of that as far as corruption is concerned. First and foremost, how that particular process put a spanner in the works for your department, which needed to reconfigure itself from just being the Department of Labor, now being Employment and Labor. Have you completed that reconfiguration process, and what does it really mean?
That process, Thabo, is not, or that change is not an event. That change is a process where we've had to reconfigure our structures. We have to do additions here and there. And that also implies, as you are reconfiguring your structures, as you are expanding your structures, because the mandate has changed, it means you have to make additions, you have to put new proposed structures which must be approved by the relevant departments. We are in that particular process, but in some areas we've been able to appoint the temporary people in order to deal with the new mandate. But I must emphasize that we're employment and labor does not necessarily mean we are the ones who are creating the employment. It means we are leading the policies which are going to lead to the creation of more employment. It means the government and the private sector, we need to come up with policies which are going to help us in creating more employment.
But, Minister, you've always been leading policy. So many are saying, well, the president announced that this department would now include employment, which in a sense meant you are now going to be playing some kind of an active role, particularly in the creation of employment. Was that a misunderstanding, or what did it actually mean? Because as the Labour Department, you've always been agitating as far as policy issues are concerned.
No. There's very clear understanding. We are playing the coordination role. We're coordinating that particular work, the various initiatives. We are leading, for instance, on what you would call the mass employment programs which we've come up with. There are various programs which are run at the presidency, which are run by the different departments. We have to do the coordination when it comes to such programs. And policy, we keep on developing policy. We keep on amending policy here and there. What has been happening before, the focus was more on the labor market. It was more of regulating the labor market and coming with the different laws. But I think now the challenges are such that we have to talk about the issue of the employment, how that is coordinated. And we're talking about the different programs, the different initiatives, which are not just initiatives by government only, which are initiatives also by the private sector. And remember that what was announced by the president last year, when he was talking about the economic recovery, reconstruction and recovery plan, it's a product of negotiation, of discussions with the social partners, making their own additions and so on. And we are playing a central role there in coordinating those parties. And then there are various programs which have been put in place, which we have to monitor now, whether they are delivering over and above our own programs or initiatives which we are implementing.
Right. We'll get into the various policies and legislations in a moment. But let's talk still on COVID-19. Some labor movements have said government has allowed employers to decimate jobs during COVID-19. By the way, they're saying this was always their plan, but you've allowed them to use COVID-19 as an scapegoat. What do you say?
No, that's totally wrong. The pandemic is a reality which has impacted everybody, the livelihood of our people and the lives of our people. And if you remember last year, the country was shut down, and not only South Africa, many countries were shut down. The issue at that particular time, and the agency was around, how do we deal with issues of occupational health and safety? That's why to us, what was more important was conducting the physical inspections and helping to craft the COVID-19 directions, and undertook training to enforce compliance with that, because people were affected, whether it's at home or at work. And that's why we had to release lots of funds and come up with a lot of directions. For instance, the compensation fund for the period of March last year up to today indicates that the workplace COVID-19 regulations were very effective. And the average, what we'd say, the average fatality rate in the workplace was at 0.2%, whereas in the communities that was more than 3%. That indicates that we've had to look into this matter very seriously. You look at our TES benefits, the temporary employer benefit, which we started paying out in April 2020, after following the announcement by the national state of disaster by the president. If you look into that up to now, we've done very well, because we've been able to pay more than 200,000 companies or employers, and representing about 5.4 million individual employees. And our cost was around 58 billion, or close to 60 billion, which was providing support to laid-off workers, their families and communities. And this was out of the discussions amongst the social partners, the employers and the employees. And unfortunately, we were required to do an overhaul of the way in which the UIF conducted our business, with greater reliance on the bulk payments, which were via the employers and the bargaining council, as well as online applications. And unfortunately, we were working under pressure. There was more urgency because of the pandemic and the imperative to prevent the labor centers from becoming super spreaders. A number of workers, even within our own departments in government, were not working. The compensation fund, as we speak now, was able to provide workers with social security net, and in the event that they lose income during this pandemic. And the compensation fund, together with a number of these assurance companies, the REN Mutual Assurance and the Federated Employers, the mutual assurance, they've accepted a liability for the cost of the medical aid treatment and the replacement of the lost income for more than 12,000 workers. But also, very interesting.
Yes, Minister, let me tell you this. Let's take a break. We'll come back. I want you to delve a little bit into what has been done, but also let's look into some of the challenges that you faced, as pointed out by the Auditor General in her audit. Stay with us. The Newsfeed Late Night continues in a moment. Questions for the Minister tonight at Newzroom 405 on 072 110 5584. We're back in a moment. Back with you here on the Newsfeed Late Night, and we continue in our conversation with Employment and Labour Minister Thulas Nxesi, taking your views and your thoughts tonight on Twitter at Newzroom 405 on 072 110 5584. Minister Nxesi, you're saying before the break an unprecedented 60 billion rands distributed via TERS during this time, not without challenges. How much of that 60 billion are you certain actually went to people who deserved it, and it really made a difference in their lives?
What I can say, the imperative to rapidly distribute the COVID-19 test benefit was not without challenges now. We were therefore grateful to the office of the AG for their assistance in analyzing the systemic weaknesses and areas requiring strengthened financial controls, because our financial controls were weak and we were exposed. But we were protected against fraud and corruption by the foresight of the UIF's campaign, which we called the Follow the Money Camp strategy, to audit all employers that received the COVID-19 test funding. And let me just tell you that up to up to the end of March 2021, 1,000 employers had been audited, and the payment to about 1.3 million workers that were verified. The auditors verified payments of 16 billion and traced 228 billion, if I'm right on that figure. 228 million, I'm sorry, that was fraudulently claimed by employers. And 30 employers are suspected of that fraudulent activities, and the Hawks and SIU are following that. About 121 employers have already been handed to the Hawks and the Presidential Fusion Center, and they have appeared, 16 of them have appeared in court. But what is very interesting, when we started this audit and we had announced it publicly, and what happened was people came back and said they made a mistake, they overclaimed, and they were overpaid. About 3 billion rand we were able it was able to be paid back. But we are still continuing with follow the money, and we think that we might be able to get something. And we're not going to rush it. The audit firms, 9 of them were appointed, are doing it meticulously, and we're going to follow up each and every cent which we have released. And we acknowledge that, and it was as a result of the poor controls within our systems.
So as far as the TERS money is concerned, what is possible and what is not possible? Many who are saying still, for example, in the hospitality sector, which has actually not fully come back. There are many who've lost their jobs there and are still unemployed, and they would like to see those funds being extended even further into 2021.
We must be realistic, Thabo. First of all, the temporal TERS scheme was really a temporal scheme. Initially, it was supposed to be 3 months, starting from April, and later on we had to extend. It was a big debate, and again, we had to extend. We can't keep on extending forever because we're talking about sustainability and affordability in the fund. And clearly, we've had to go deep into the reserves, which reserves, I think, by now we were warned by our own actuaries. But at that time, remember, a number of sectors in the economy, there was a total shutdown. But now it's open. We know that some of them are going to struggle to come back. But I don't think the UIF has enough funding to be able to deal with that. But now there is a permanent test which we are having to relieve the employers once they are retrenched, and for that period. And what we are saying, therefore, is we do have this, which is going to be helping those who have been retrenched. We do have the CCMA, which is also trying to help in the disputes when people are getting retrenched. We do have Productivity South Africa, which is an entity which helps the companies which are going down, sitting with them, looking into your books, and say, how are we going to be able to help those companies that are going down, where we can be able to afford. So we're trying a number of measures to help in this situation.
CCMA, let's talk that a little bit. They've seen some budget cuts in this particular budget, which meant that their turnaround times have been affected. Now, workers will be dismissed. Initially, it would take a period of 30 days to turn that one around. Now it's taking more than 6 months to resolve matters. What's being done to speed up that process of resolutions at the CCMA?
What is important is that we must not exaggerate this setup. The budget cut in the CCMA cannot just be termed as a train smash. Why do I say that? Their cut is only 5%. And we were explaining that even in Parliament today. Their cut is only 5%. There are programs, all programs in the department where the cut is more than 5%. Some of them it's 10%. But remember this, it was about affordability, what the government could be able to afford. It was as a result of this pandemic, where we've had to relook at the priorities when we're dealing with the budgetary issues. And therefore, everybody, every department has been touched by these guys. Unfortunately, we have to work with what we are having, but it must not be blown out of proportion.
But what does it mean for workers, though, Minister? In reality, it means part-time commissioners are no longer afforded or affordable.
That is also blown out of proportion, because what you do, you relook at your own budget and you say, how are we going to prioritize? Which areas are we going to prioritize? It has happened with all the departments. It has happened with the Department of Employment and Labor, with all the entities. And some of them have been affected even more than the CCMA has been, which means the management of the CCMA should sit and rethink and reprioritize. That's what it means. You work with the cloth which you are having, unfortunately.
So when a worker who is up against an employer is looking for a settlement, will they now find themselves in a situation there they've got to settle as quickly as possible? Otherwise, this process is just going to take too long.
Some of the processes have been taking long even before the pandemic. Let's not just use the pandemic and the cuts which we're having. Unless people are able to suggest, where do we get the money? They must suggest, where do you get the money? But what we are saying, work with what you are having. Reprioritize your programs. That's what we are saying.
Let's look at other policies then, Minister. The minimum wage legislation, I think it's coming into its 2-year anniversary, or just past its 2-year anniversary so far. How is it working? Are companies compliant? To tell you why, some companies have felt that we don't have to comply with this particular act because the Department of Labor doesn't have capacity or even inspectors to be able to catch us in simple terms. So it's business as usual.
No. I think we must be able to say it's not business as usual. The minimum wage, a number of companies in terms of our research are implementing that minimum wage. And the various companies who are having problems, or employers who have problems, they do have a right to apply to the Minimum Wage Commission to indicate when they are struggling. And then they can be exempted, provided they are going to open up all their books and be honest, and then those who are able to help them will be able to get all the necessary information and make a ruling. Yeah. But some of the people want to use this in order to hide and in order not to pay the minimum wage.
So is it correct then to say from your statement that the Minimum Wage Commission does not have data? It relies on the employers to give it the data.
It does. They do the research from time to time. And remember that it's not very long that we've implemented the minimum wage. And they are still doing that particular research. And the preliminary results which they are having is that the majority of the employers are complying. There will be those who are not complying.
And what impact has it had? I mean, some research showing that it has not been able at least to stamp out poverty or even give workers a dignified life. And many are calling for a review, which you had said would happen so that it's reviewed either up or wherever it needs to go.
No, we do have lobby groups who are arguing that the minimum wage must be done away with because it's killing jobs. We do have also from the side of the trade union movement and a number of NGOs who are arguing that this is not enough. And all we are saying, research has been done. It has been done. The University of Cape Town, the University of the Western Cape, before we came into that particular determination, it was informed by research. And it looked into all those issues of the affordability. We're not going to accept that we do away with the minimum wage. It's just that people want to continue paying slave wages, and all they're interested in is their profits, not about the workers. But we are also saying we must do it in such a way that there's affordability. And if you look at what we've done with the domestic workers, with the farm workers, we've not just taken that and put it at where the minimum wage is. We've said we are going to use a gradualistic approach in order to be able to reach there. And this minimum wage is reviewed on an annual basis. It's going to go up, looking into the inflation, looking into and affordability and so on. It's not just something which we just do it without doing proper research and proper thinking. So we have to adopt a balanced approach when we're dealing with this particular matter.
When will it be reviewed and lifted? I mean, domestic workers, there are some who still earn 15 rands per hour.
We have said it is reviewed on an annual basis. So next year we are going to do a review and we'll make the announcement.
Minister of Employment and Labour, Minister Thulas Nxesi, is still with us. We'll come back with some of your WhatsApp questions in a moment here on the Newsfeed Late Night. Stay with us. You're live on Newzroom Afrika, channel 405, here on the Newsfeed Late Night, in conversation with Employment and Labour Minister Thulas Nxesi, and taking your thoughts tonight on Twitter at Newzroom 405, on the WhatsApp line 072-110-5584. As we go to break, some of the employers, Minister, are questioning when will the Employment Equity Amendment Bill come into place, because equality in the workplace is a serious issue, especially when you're talking salary inequality and discrepancies. When is that matter going to be settled? Minister Nxesi, you're muted. If you can unmute for us there, please.
Sorry for that.
Yeah.
We have done the bill. We have submitted it into Parliament. You understand the separation of powers. That is now in the scope of Parliament to talk about the processes on how to deal with that. So the matter now is in front of the Parliament.
So talk to me how you feel the set targets are going to make any difference, right? We've got 15% of managers in industry who are Africans, when in population they're 78%. You're setting specific targets or for specific occupational levels. How will they be enforced?
First of all, Thabo, have been forced into this situation because our argument has always been the employers themselves must come up with their own plans on how they are going to be able to deal with this. But for the number of the past years, we see that there's very little progress. In fact, there is resistance from some of the employers. It's on this basis that now we are saying there must be a compulsion. And we must be able to say to them, put the targets, and then we are going to be able to monitor your targets. And then we are going to come with measures which are punitive if we are not meeting those particular targets. And of course, it's not going to be targets very short term, and what we call, I would say, in the short term, you must be able to do 1, 2, 3. We're going to give you enough space so that you can be able to do the proper planning and so on, and you bind yourself. And then if you don't do that, we're going to come very hard on you, because we can't, after 27 years, we seated with this picture which we're having in the country.
So what do you mean by penalties exactly?
We will determine the penalties. If it means we have to impose fines, we will impose fines. If it means we have to stop people not doing businesses, we will have to do that. But we know that it's going to be a big fight. But the intention for us, it's not to be punitive, it's to be corrective. But I think we've done that for the past few years, and some of the people are resisting that. What do? We are forced to be punitive if people do not want to change. Change is imperative in this particular country, where there was a lot of discrimination and certain positions are reserved for a few people.
Now, there are those who are running scared to say, well, what happens if I set targets and I fail to implement those targets for justifiable reasons?
Then you must justify that, and you must be transparent and tell us. And then once you put convincing reasons, there will be there's no reason that you must be punished. You must be able to justify openly.
Let's look at some questions coming through then tonight on WhatsApp. This one from Pretoria, Blumko Ntlachana saying, given the existing high unemployment figures exacerbated by COVID-19, most importantly by the historic exploitation of those that might be likely to have mega employment by the labor brokering system. So my question to the minister is for him to share the current reforms that might be underway and subsequently in place to either mitigate or permanently abolish the exploitative system of labor broking.
This has become a very complex matter. That the labor brokers have a very, very little role to play in the labor market situation. And I think it was debated for a number of years. But what was very clear constitutionally, because people have the right to freedom of association, they could not be banned, but the conditions were made to be very stringent, so that the way they have to operate must not be to exploit the workers. And amongst other things was this issue of who employs a particular worker, because the tendency has been between the labor broker and that particular company, whenever a worker has a problem or has been injured, no one wants to own that. Those are the issues which were addressed by the previous minister together with the department. And as we speak now, their scope is very, very limited, and they have to abide by the labor legislation in the country in terms of the employment contracts, the basic conditions of employment, on all the issues which the workers did not have, who were working under or operating under the labor brokers. But we know that in some of the areas, people still do illegal things and violate the legislation. That's where our inspectors are going to come in, and we request the trade unions, because the unions and the shop stewards in particular, they are our eyes and ears on the shop floor. We request them to interact with our structures so that we can be able to follow up where there is still such exploitation.
So, Minister, you're saying we're still far from doing away with labor brokers. So they will still be around, but they will have to be monitored.
Definitely, that's what we're saying. That's why even now we've tried to increase our inspection. I mean, our inspectors. We've just added 500 inspectors. That's still not enough, because we're talking about more than 2 million companies who are registered there. And if you're talking more than 2 million employers, and then you only have about 900 inspectors, it's not going to be easy. And what we're trying to say, we will continue to monitor some of those, but we must work in partnerships with some of the people in the private sector who are cooperating, and also with the unions to expose some of these exploitative tendencies.
Minister, back into your department, this one from Tabani in Mooikloof. He says, what measures have you put in place to systematically protect against corruption within your own department?
Well, it's the ordinary measures which are there in terms of the PFMA, that the workers have to respect, or the workers of the department have to respect and deal with the issues of the tenders accordingly. And that's what is in place. And of course, there must be consequences once there are people who have violated all those things, or once there are people who are found in fraudulent activities. That's what we're dealing with. That's why now there's serious consequent management in the department. That's why we are charging some people, especially arising out of what happened last year in terms of the report which were given by the Auditor General. So we've put all those measures, strict controls, as recommended also by the PFMA, as recommended by the AG, out of the witnesses which were seen last year. So we are implementing all those, and I think we're putting a lot of whistleblowing in the departments and hotlines and so on, in order to be able to deal with all these issues.
But particularly around the recommendations of the Auditor General to develop solutions, to identify gaps and risks. What exactly have you done in practical terms?
A report which was submitted back to the AG or in our interaction with the AG, we've been able to deal with those controls which they've been complaining about. But amongst other things, we've been able to look at our data because we were utilizing a data which was outdated. That's why we ended up paying people. Some of them were civil servants, some of them were double dipping in other different social relief schemes. Because we were using outdated data, we've been able to interact with the Home Affairs in order to be able that we are linking up with them to deal with what I would say up-to-date data, so that we also do not pay people who are deceased, because these were all the problems.
It came down people to and minors. So you're saying to us, you have cleaned out your database. It's not something that we are going to encounter going forward.
Well, there's one thing which we must accept. We can still encounter problems, but I don't think that at a larger scale like it happened last year. But you must remember, these unscrupulous people, both employers and employees, and criminals, when it comes to this area of the IT, they are always ahead of us, and we must also try to be ahead of them. So it always happens. You know, it happens even in the banks where we thought that there's a lot of security. So the issue of fraud and corruption will always be there. But we must put systems so that if they are able to hack our systems, at least we are able to quickly respond to that.
What has happened to the UIF Commissioner in that case?
It must not be the UIF Commissioner only. There are a number of officials whom we have suspended. And we were using the SIU to do the investigation. And remember, we have the labor law. We put a precautionary suspensions until we've been able to put formal charges. I'm not comfortable in talking about this topic at the public level because we might compromise the case of the department, but we can say some we've already put the charges and some were finalizing the charges. We can only be comfortable to talk about that once we have completed and made a public announcement as who has been charged, who has not been charged. But remember that our laws are also very strict in talking about how you deal with the disciplinary process.
Yeah. So, I mean, safe to say that the UIF Commissioner is still on suspension, precautionary suspension with full pay at this particular point.
Yes, and unfortunately, we have to follow the process, because if we don't follow the process, you might even lose that particular case. So the process is as important as the outcome of what you're looking for. So it's very important that we become meticulous. You know, our labor laws, they are very, very strict.
But the question for the general public then becomes, is there no degree there of wasting money where we continue with such cases for long? I mean, 8 months ago, he was on precautionary suspension. It has taken that long while he's being paid fully his salary.
Thabo, we've had cases which go beyond 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, but Minister, that's not an excuse. Not to say we've had cases and so it's okay for that to happen.
I am saying you are trying to suggest that because there's pressure that people have been there for too long, we must violate the processes. We must wait for the proper investigation, and then after those investigations, we do that. We don't have the investigative capacity to deal with that. We rely on the SIU. And the reality is that the SIU was overstretched last year by a number of the investigations. We can't just do things without following the proper procedures and those investigations. We're not going to do that. And we can't rush those for the sake of rushing them. Let's make sure that we have not missed any particular step. We've followed all the steps if we want to deal with these matters.
Employment and Labour Minister Thulas Nxesi is staying with us. We'll come back in a moment with more of your questions at Newzroom 405 072 110 5584. The news feed late night continues next. You're live on the Newzroom Afrika channel 405, news feed late night, and in conversation tonight with Employment and Labour Minister Thulas Nxesi, and taking your questions as well on 072 110 5584, on Twitter at Newzroom 405. What questions do you have for the Minister? Minister, we of course saw even during the time of the pandemic last year, unfortunately, the freight industry under turmoil with a number of attacks that we saw on our roads. Now, there is a task team that has been doing work to come up with new laws on how to navigate that particular question. Update us on the work of that task team and what they've achieved so far.
Our President Ramaphosa assigned me and the Minister of Home Affairs to co-chair an interministerial committee of 12 departments on the issue of labor migration and employment, and to advise the cabinet on that policy. So migration management is very complex and sensitive. And why do I say that, Thabo? It's because there are various international conventions which are protecting the refugees, illegal, both legal and illegal. They are protected, and South Africa has signed those protocols, be it at the ILO, at the UN, and so on. So as a department, we will submit that national labor migration policy and propose amendments to the Employment Services Act to Cabinet. So the revised policy should be released. It should be released to the general public, and in June, after we've concluded the internal government consultations. Yeah. It's within the context of the new policy and draft amendment that will be introducing, and I must put this, we'll be introducing some quotas in the labor market, and as part of our commitment and the contribution towards the SADC region, we will allow a certain number of their nationals to come and work here. We will, however, limit those numbers, and in limiting those numbers, what each employer can be able to employ. This is to ensure that South Africans are not overlooked for employment by some unscrupulous employers, and that foreign nationals are also not subjected to inferior working conditions, because some of the employers are taking these employees or prefer these employees because they see them as desperate because of political instability in their countries, as cheap labor, and do not even respect the basic what we call labor legislation. And that's what is informing this. And we are going to be looking into this matter, and we're saying foreign or what should also enjoy the rights, because the workers' rights are human rights. So on this particular area, we would be able to say, we would be able to make those pronouncements once we've been able to do our internal government consultations and allow the public now to deal with the issues.
It's a straight question from many in the freight industry, particularly the drivers, who are saying, when you give that type of an answer, right, to say, is our government telling us they are prioritizing keeping these migration corridors open, allowing neighboring labor seekers to come into the country for better jobs and better wages, more than they are prioritizing us here in the country?
Not long ago, Thabo, the president and with the Minister of Trade and Industry, Minister Patel, have been leading a process with the Minister of DERCO, the International Affairs, have been leading a process to talk about the African free or continental free trade. That's very, very important. If we want to expand our base, if we want to expand our market, there's no way that we're going to exclude the whole of this continent, which gives us access to 1 billion people. Therefore, this issue of the employment of people between the countries, we're not going to be able to do away with if we want our economy to expand. And what we are saying, we're not going to protect the illegal employed drivers in the freight industry at the expense of the South Africa. What we are saying, in the midst of this massive unemployment, we have to look into the question of what we would call the low skills, where you don't need highly skilled people to be taken from outside. However, what you cannot do, you cannot pass a legislation which says you are excluding those people totally. That would be against the Constitution. You need that balancing act. But we must accept that the issue of labor migration is an international phenomenon. which needs to be managed. It's not an easy matter. It's happening in all the regions of this world. That's what we are trying to do. We're having discussions with the different unions. We have formed the forums in the freight industry where we keep on reporting to them what is happening and updating them when we're going to be able to release this. And what we've also condemned is this element of violence, where people are just touching the trucks and so on. That is not going to be tolerated, and we're very clear. That's why we're working jointly with the police, the Home Affairs and so on, that those who are responsible for violence, the law is going to be harsh on them. However, dialogue must continue so that we have a proper policy which is going to be able to protect all. We are a country which is based on the human rights, including the rights of the people from the other countries.
Now, you are opening a labor center recently in the Eastern Cape, I believe, and I want to talk about the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. It has been amended, but while you were there in the Eastern Cape, I saw in one of the reportage a story of a gentleman who's been kicked around there by the employer without any action really being taken on the employer. The exploitation of workers continues, even the harassment and the brutalization of employers unabated. Minister, what is being done?
One of the problems which is facing us, Thabo, especially in the countryside, in the rural areas, has been the workers who are very vulnerable because they are not unionized. And I must be honest, unions play a very, very critical role in terms of working with us in exposing the exploitation and the violation of the different workers. So most of those workers, be it in the farms, be it in the retail shops, you find that they are not unionized. And that gives us problems. And we think that it's one of the areas which we are going to be targeting. And that's why now, when I was in Mount Elif, the Deputy Minister was in Ruth Mampati district and also doing some work there and doing some inspections with the inspectors. We're moving into what I would call the rural districts and where our offices are, and visiting and pouncing on some of the employers without any notice. And we're going to be doing more of that, and working with Home Affairs, working with transport, working with SARBs in order to be able to deal with those employers who are still violating. But we're also requesting that the workers must be able to report some of these cases to our labor centers, and so that we can be able to quickly follow them up. And they can also report these cases even in the municipality offices, so that the municipalities can be able to get in touch with the various labor centers or their nearest labor center to be able to report these cases. But we still request that the unions have a very important role to play. It's unfortunate that we're seeing the splintering of the unions, the divisions, and which is weakening the trade union movement on the ground, whereas that unity is very, very important. So during this month, the Workers' Month, we will be doing lots of inspections. But of course, we're not going to be able to touch each and every employer. We'll target certain hotspot areas.
All right, let's get a more specific question around the TERS and the UIF. This one from Midrand. It's Vuyo in Waterfall saying, I'd like to ask the Minister about the UIF TERS money for people who are under affected sectors on when these appeal processes will finish, as we are still stuck not knowing when we will receive the funds or whether we will receive them or not. We are under the qualifying sector.
I can't be able, Thabo, to give a specific date, because each and every case is assessed and judged on its own merit. The cases are not the same. There are cases which are straightforward, which is easy to pay, and that has happened. But there are cases which are a bit complex, which need some investigation. But what we can assure the people is that we are going to make a follow-up where there is a case that we pay, even if it's how long we'll be able to pay. The danger is if we rush and quickly pay, later on it might be found that it was not the right payment. That's why we have to be careful. Those are some of the issues which were raised by the AG last year. So we are very meticulous now on how we have to follow those processes of the investigation. But we do the investigation. But we must apologize. We know that that has inconvenienced the people. Some of this was part of their living. But unfortunately, we have to follow those processes.
Quick one on skills development then, Minister. Some of the workers say, well, as far as skills development is concerned, companies think teaching me how to drive a forklift or first aid training, that qualifies as skills development. Apprenticeship, artisan training, recognition of prior learning, nothing.
There has been, if you look into our legislation, all these issues which you're talking about are supposed to have been done by the employers long ago. These are some of the issues which we are looking at when our inspectors are getting there to find out what is exactly what is the company plan in terms of the areas which we are talking about. And if it's not there, we're able to make recommendations. We know that this issue of training and retraining has become a big issue, but also with the labor activation program which we have under the UIF, we are able to focus on the various areas where we do some training for the workers who are retrenched, for the workers, the young people, and we're working in collaboration with higher education and the various sectors in the different sectors in order to be able to, I would say, to massify training in the different areas. But what is important now is for us to coordinate our resources rather than different small initiatives which are not talking to one another.
I appreciate your time, and thank you very much for joining us tonight for this conversation on the Newsfeed Late Night. The Employment and Labour Minister, Thulas Nxesi. Appreciate your time tonight. And